Hi everybody, and welcome back to our final discussion of Chapter 8, Cardiorespiratory Responses to Acute Exercise. This will be our final chapter of Unit 2. So, we are now going to bring together our cardiovascular and our pulmonary responses to acute exercise. So let's focus on the cardiovascular first. So we know when we start participating in acute physical activity, there's going to need to be an increase to blood flow to the working muscles. This is going to force us to alter our heart function, peripheral circulatory adaptations. This is going to involve changes in heart rate, stroke volume, cardiac output, blood pressure, blood flow, and actual characteristics of the blood. So let's dive in a little bit deeper. We know that the resting heart rate normally ranges somewhere between 60 and 80 beats per minute in untrained individuals and can get as low as 30 to 40 beats per minute in trained individuals. Typically, unless you have a very elite endurance athlete, a trained individual hangs out around 60 to 70 beats per minute. We can also have this heart rate affected by the neural tone, temperature, and altitude. So if you remember back in our previous discussion, we talked about how the vagus nerve and the sympathetic nervous system can alter our resting heart rate. Additionally, our heart rate can respond to something called an anticipatory response. This is when our heart rate is going to start increasing above the resting heart rate levels just before the start of exercise. So psychologically, we are amping ourselves up for physical activity performance. This is where we start to see a decrease in vagal tone and an increase in norepinephrine and epinephrine release. Once we actually start participating in exercise or physical activity, our heart rate is going to increase in a manner that is directly proportional to the exercise intensity. And this is going to continue until we reach our maximal heart rate or our heart rate max. This is the highest heart rate that the body can achieve in an all-out effort to volitional fatigue. Measuring somebody's maximal heart rate is highly reproducible. It's something that once somebody is acquainted with going there to volitional fatigue, we can see them do this over and over. We also know that maximal heart rate will decline slightly with age. This is a good way to estimate. Shorthand would be 220 minus your age in years. So for example, if I have a 20-year-old subject, 220 minus 20 would give me an estimated max heart rate of around 200. This is quick shorthand if you need to do this quickly in the field, but there is between a 12 and 15% beat per minute error on either side. So knowing, using this equation, 220 minus the age of a 20-year-old individual would be 200, but that could be plus or minus 15 beats per minute on either side. The better equation to use if you have the time to do the math would be 208 minus 0.7 times their age in years. Again, much better if you can have time to do the math, and then the ultimate test would actually be to take somebody to their heart rate max. So once we start participating in physical activity, if we maintain intensity, we're going to achieve something called the steady state heart rate. So this is the plateau and the optimal heart rate for meeting the circulatory demands at a given submaximal intensity. So we know if intensity continues to increase, so will our steady state heart rate. This adjustment to a new intensity takes somewhere between 2 and 3 minutes. So the heart rate doesn't just magically fall in step. We know our steady state heart rate is going to be the basis for most of our simple exercise tests, like a Bruce and a Bulky protocol, which I will talk about a little bit later in the course, which are kind of our foundational tests for estimating aerobic fitness and a heart rate max. So as you can see here, this is a graph that shows the changes in intensity as measured as a percent of your heart rate max and how this kind of falls proportionally with increases in heart rate. So this next one shows kind of the differences between two individuals. They both have the same predicted heart rate max, so they could be the same age or the same level of development. And then looking here, we can see though that they have two very distinct VO2 patterns. So subject A is of much better fitness than subject B. So even though we can have the same predicted heart rate max, we can use that heart rate max and it can have vast varieties in somebody's fitness level. The next thing we need to talk about is heart rate variability. So we need to measure heart rate with rhythmic fluctuation. So since we're constantly having changes in our sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, our heart rate is also going to kind of fluctuate within a space. This happens both at rest and during exercise. So your heart rate doesn't stay the same the entire time. You'll have a little bit of a bounce somewhere between 3 and 5 beats per minute within a particular exercise or rest range. We also know that heart rate can be influenced by a few other factors, such as your core body temperature, your sympathetic nerve activity, and your respiratory rate. So for example, someone may still be at rest, but all of a sudden they just found out that they need to do a presentation next class that they forgot about. Now you're not participating in physical activity, but that sympathetic nervous system, that fight or flight response is going to start to kick in. This means that you're probably going to start to get nervous. Maybe your heart starts to race. Maybe you start to sweat. Maybe you start to breathe and hyperventilate a little bit. This would be an example of, even though we're not participating in physical activity, that sympathetic nervous system kicked in and caused a change in my heart rate. Typically, we're going to analyze these factors with respect to frequency, not necessarily time. The next consideration is stroke volume. We know this will increase with intensity to about 40 to 60% of the VO2 max. Beyond this, the stroke volume will kind of plateau to exhaustion. So this means any changes in cardiac output after about 40 to 60% of VO2 max is strictly going to be based off of heart rate. The only possible exception to this kind of summary statement is elite endurance athletes can usually eke out a little bit more out of their stroke volume than the average person. This means that our maximal exercise stroke volume is going to be double what our standing stroke volume is. But maximal exercise stroke volume is only slightly higher than supine stroke volume. And this is because supine stroke volume is going to be much higher than standing stroke volume. This is just basically the nature of having to overcome gravity. So as we can see here, we have an example where we're measuring stroke volume as a relationship to VO2 max percentages. So you can kind of see this plateau effect in stroke volume. So as I've mentioned before, we have differences in VO2 max. We have differences in stroke volume. There is not a huge difference if you look between heart rate and our AVO2. This means that after a certain point, all of the changes that are going to occur are due to stroke volume and heart rate. So what actually changes stroke volume? Well, first we can increase preload. So this is due to end diastolic ventricular stretch. As we increase the stretch, or we increase the end diastolic volume, this is going to increase the contraction strength. This is referred to as the Frank-Starling mechanism. So if I can increase the amount of blood that is in the ventricle before it contracts, this is going to force the contraction to be stronger. The next is an increase in contractility. This is just an inherent ventricle property. As we increase norepinephrine and epinephrine presence, we're going to increase contractility. This is going to work independently of end diastolic volume. Its job mainly is to increase the ejection fraction instead of the contraction strength. And then finally, we have a decrease in afterload. This means that we're going to have changes in aortic resistance due to vasodilation, so more blood will leave the heart more efficiently. How this will change during exercise. So when we increase that preload at lower intensities, we increase the stroke volume. This also means that we will be increasing venous return and therefore increasing end diastolic volume and increasing preload. This works through our muscle and our respiratory pumps, as well as our venous reserves be more efficient in returning blood to the heart. Also, as we increase the heart rate, we are decreasing filling time, which means we're going to have a slight decline in our end diastolic volume and can also have a slight decline in stroke volume. This is why we reach a plateau effect. Eventually, when you reach a certain point with the heart rate, you can't fill fast enough to match the increases in preload to improve the stroke volume. They kind of cancel each other out and hold steady at a certain point. We also know that an increase in contractility at higher intensities can increase stroke volume, and the decline in afterload via vasodilation increases stroke volume. So these are all going to kind of work together to increase stroke volume up until that certain point. The next consideration is the cardiac output. We know cardiac output is heart rate times stroke volume, and we know cardiac output will increase with the increase in intensity and start to plateau near somebody's VO2 max. We know our normal resting values, as we discussed back in chapter 6. It is around 5 liters per minute. Untrained, when we start having them exercise, can be around 20 liters per minute, and our highly trained individuals can get as high as 40 liters per minute. We also know that cardiac output maximums are going to be a function of body size as well as aerobic fitness. This is a chart that kind of shows that incline unit distance matches pretty nicely with our heart rate, with some slight variations in terms of how it goes percentage of VO2 max, but it matches up very nicely with our heart rate max. The next consideration is something called the Fick principle, which we've already previously discussed. We know that this is the calculation of tissue oxygen consumption depending on blood flow and oxygen extraction. This is basically VO2 equals cardiac output times the AVO2 difference. But I want you to also start to think about what cardiac output is. So I can also calculate this as heart rate times stroke volume times AVO2 difference. So this is an example that shows heart rates and how they change over several different types of physical activity. So we notice that there is an increase from lying, sitting, standing. It's very subtle, but there is a slight increase. And then once we go from kind of our resting activities, moving up, walking, jogging, running are all going to increase our beats per minute. So here we are going to see the interaction with stroke volume. So stroke volume, we know our stroke volume is pretty high when we are laying down because the heart is not having to overcome gravity. And then we're going to have this kind of movement downwards going from sitting to standing because now we are fighting gravity at certain levels. And then we have the increase walking, jogging, running due to participation of the sympathetic nervous system stimulating an increase in stroke volume response. And this is kind of the summary of how this impacts cardiac output. So we can see that even though heart rate pretty much stays the same between lying, sitting, and standing, our cardiac output is slightly changed due to the stroke volume. And then we see the walking, jogging, running increasing as we would normally expect. The next consideration is blood pressure. So we know during endurance exercise, we're going to see an increase in mean arterial pressure. That is because the systolic blood pressure is going to increase proportional to exercise intensity, while the diastolic blood pressure is going to have a slight decline or slight incline when we're talking about maximal exercise. Typically, we just expect diastolic volume to stay the same, but you can have some slight variations due to the vasodilation or vasoconstriction in the body. We know mean arterial pressure is the cardiac output times the total peripheral resistance. Therefore, as cardiac output increases, total peripheral resistance has to decrease slightly. Again, this is due to vasodilation versus sympatholysis. Another important thing with blood pressure is the rate pressure product. This is the heart rate times your systolic blood pressure. This is going to be related to our myocardial oxygen uptake and our myocardial blood flow. We know that resistance training is going to have the largest impact on our rate pressure product because we're having these large periodic increases in maximal arterial pressure. This can get up as high as 480 and 350 millimeters of mercury. This is especially common to happening when you use the Valsalva maneuver. So when people are going through maximal effort exercises, these blood pressures are getting incredibly high, which means that this can be dangerous for certain populations. So if you have an individual that already has high blood pressure, or perhaps an individual who is pregnant, this is going to kind of be a big deal in terms of what type of resistance exercise training you ask them to do. It is also very common when individuals use the Valsalva maneuver or are going through a maximal effort for individuals to pass out. I've had many times where I have started seeing stars while lifting, And I haven't fully passed out, but I have definitely had to sit down several times from a maximal effort lift. This is very, very common and needs to be monitored closely. The next conversation is going to be about blood flow redistribution. So we know as cardiac output increases, we're going to increase the available blood flow. We then have to take that increased blood flow and redirect it to the areas with the greatest metabolic need, which typically is our exercising muscles. This means the blood will be shunted away from our less active regions by the sympathetic vasoconstriction. So like splenic circulation to the liver, pancreas, and GI is going to kind of be shut off. Certain blood flow through the kidneys will also be kind of lessened. We also know that localized vasodilation will permit additional blood flow to our exercising muscles. So local vasodilation will be triggered by our metabolic endothelial products, what we just talked about in Chapter 7. We also have sympathetic vasoconstriction in muscles to offset sympatholysis, and this means that our localized vasodilation is going to be greater than our neural vasoconstriction. Also, as our temperature starts to rise, the skin vasodilation also has to occur. This is going to be a decrease in sympathetic vasoconstriction and an increase in sympathetic vasodilation. So if you remember, our blood vessels don't actually have a parasympathetic response. It's either the sympathetic system being on or less on. This is going to allow heat loss through the skin. So as you can see here, this is an example of the relative total blood volumes at the certain areas of the body. So if we look at rest, we're going to have a few different areas. So our red is going to be our kidneys, liver, stomach, intestines, so our general viscera. Blue will be our skin. Yellow will be our muscles, green will be our heart, and red, this lighter red will be our brain. So we can see as we start participating in physical activity, more and more blood is going to travel to the heart, or sorry, to the muscles. And then we will have a greater percentage sent to the skin to help us cool off. This is going to be an important concept that not a lot of people consider is cardiovascular drift. We start to see cardiovascular drift associated when we see an increase in core body temperature and with dehydration. This is because stroke volume is going to start to decline. This is because we have skin blood flow increasing and plasma volume decreasing due to sweating because we're trying to offload heat. This means we're going to have a decline in our venous return and preload. So even though I have not changed my intensity of physical activity, my heart rate is going to start to drift upwards to compensate and maintain cardiac output. So basically this is my intensity hasn't changed, but the longer I participate in physical activity, the more dehydrated I become, the warmer my core body temperature becomes. It's going to require a higher heart rate to participate in the same amount of physical activity. So this is an example that demonstrates cardiac drift. These values are going to be expressed as a percentage of change from the values measured at the 10-minute point of exercise. So we can see here the heart rate is going to steadily increase even though the intensity has not changed. So another thing to consider is the competition for blood supply. We know exercise and other demands for blood flow are going to create competition for our limited cardiac output. So muscles plus eating are going to compete with each other. So if you had a large meal right before you participate in physical activity, your body's going to be fighting the demands of the working muscles, but also breaking down the food that's sitting heavy in your stomach. Also, if you're exercising in the heat, those exercising muscles are also going to be competing for blood supply through the skin that are trying to offload heat. So if we have multiple demands going on, we may inadvertently decrease muscle blood flow. So this is why it's not great to consume really heavy meals before participating in physical activity and to try to keep yourself cool when you're participating in exercise and physical activity in the heat. The next consideration is our blood oxygen content. So we know we measure this in two different ways, the primary one being the AVO2 difference. So to measure this, we know we take arterial oxygen content minus the mixed venous oxygen content. We know at resting we're around 6, max exercise we're somewhere between 16 and 17. We also know our mixed venous return, we tend to see oxygen greater than 4 milliliters of oxygen per 100 milliliters of blood. This means if we're coming from an active muscle, we'll probably have no oxygen left. And if we're coming from an inactive tissue, we're going to see a slight increase. So we'll actually see an increase in mixed venous O2 content, not just straight venous content. So this figure is going to show the differences in the mixed venous content versus the arterial content and how this is going to be expressed as an AVO2 difference. The next consideration is the plasma volume. So we know our capillary fluid movement is going to go into and out of tissue, and this will be regulated by hydrostatic pressure, as well as osmotic pressures. So when we're exchanging oxygen and CO2, we're also at some level exchanging fluids like plasma through those capillary membranes. That means when we are participating in upright exercise, we can see declines in plasma volume, and this can compromise our exercise performance. This is because when we have an increase in the mean arterial pressure, we're also increasing the capillary hydrostatic pressure, meaning more fluid is being forced out of the blood to carry more oxygen into the tissues and get CO2 out. This can also lead to metabolite buildup, which will also increase tissue osmotic pressure. And then in addition, if you're trying to offload heat, you're going to start sweating. This will further decline the plasma volume. So this is an example here of a blood vessel. So both the blood pressure inside the blood vessel and the ionotic pressure of the tissue can cause our plasma to flow from the intravascular space into the interstitial space, so the space between tissues. This pressure in the tissue is going to exert on the blood vessel, and the ionotic pressure from the blood vessel inside the blood vessel is going to cause the plasma to be reabsorbed. We're having net filtration occur of that plasma, and it can be determined by summing the outward forces and subtracting the inward forces, and this will give us a net capillary filtration. The next consideration is our hemoconcentration. So we know due to sweating and this increase in pressure forcing plasma into the interstitial space that we're going to decrease blood volume. This means we're actually going to change our hemoconcentration. So the fluid percentage in the blood is declining, so this means the cell percentage of blood is going to increase. This means our hematocrit can increase up to 50% of our blood content or beyond. So the net effects of this is our red blood cell concentration will increase, our hemoglobin concentration will increase, and our oxygen carrying capacity can increase. So this decrease in plasma volume isn't necessarily a bad thing if I'm participating in endurance type activities. I'm actually carrying hemoglobin better, which means I'm carrying oxygen better, and I have a better concentration of red blood cells. However, there is a tipping point. So once you lose so much blood plasma, I start to have too much hemoconcentration, and I'm going to start to see detriment to performance. We also have central regulation that occurs with our cardiovascular responses. So what is going to actually stimulate this rapid change in heart rate, cardiac output, and blood pressure during exercise? Typically, we're going to have a metabolite buildup in the muscle, and then the heart rate will start to increase within 1 second of the onset of exercise. And this is all going to be measured by central command. These are the higher centers of the brain, and they're going to co-activate our motor and cardiovascular centers in response to exercise and metabolite buildup. So this is a nice summary slide. This would be a good time to pause your video and take some notes. So let's actually integrate this all together. Our cardiovascular responses to exercise are going to be complex, fast, and finely tuned, with their first priority being the maintenance of blood pressure. So blood flow can be maintained only as long as blood pressure can remain stable. Our blood pressure is actually going to be prioritized before other needs in the body. So now let's take a moment and shift gears to the ventilation and respiratory responses during exercise. So When we start to participate in physical activity and exercise, we're going to have an immediate increase in ventilation. This is before muscle contractions, and it's going to be an anticipatory response from central command. We know exercise is about to happen, so we are going to prepare for it, very similarly to how the sympathetic nervous system is going to start ramping up heart rate even before participation begins. We will then have a gradual second phase of increase in ventilation. This is going to be driven by our chemical changes in our arterial blood, as well as the increase in carbon dioxide and hydrogen ions sensed by the chemoreceptors in our bloodstream. We're also going to get changes based on our right arterial stretch receptor. Then we will have a ventilation increase that is proportional to the metabolic needs of our muscles. So we know at low intensity exercise, we're only going to see increases in our tidal volume. However, at high intensity exercise, we're also going to see tidal volume increases as well as increases in breathing rate. Our ventilation recovery after exercise will be delayed. This is because recovery takes several minutes. This tends to be regulated by blood pH, the pressure of carbon dioxide in the blood, as well as the temperature. So as you can see here in this graph, this is how ventilation is going to change as we go through the duration of physical activity. So when you see we go through light physical activity, there's going to be a slight increase in our pulmonary ventilation, and that comes down pretty smoothly and quite proportionally. As we bump up the intensity, this ventilation increase is going to take longer to occur, but it's also going to take longer to play catch up when we're done with physical activity. So there are a few different breathing irregularities we need to be aware of. The first being exercise-induced asthma. This tends to be seen in the form of lower airway obstruction, so coughing, wheezing, or dyspnea. And this is typically because more water is evaporated from the airway surface. So this is going to disrupt the airway epithelium and cause injury of the microvasculature. So what is dyspnea? I just used that word. That means shortness of breath. This is common in individuals with poor aerobic fitness. If somebody's just out of shape, it's something to keep track of, but not particularly be worried about. This is typically because there's an inability to adjust to the high blood pressure of carbon dioxide and all of the hydrogen ions that have just showed up. Fatigue in the respiratory muscles is going to kind of drive this increase in ventilation. So pay attention to shortness of breath. If it's just because somebody's out of shape, obviously monitor it and maybe back off the activity a little bit as they start to improve their fitness. You can bump it back up again. However, if this is unjust dyspnea, like with an asthma attack or somebody who may struggle with COPD or another undiagnosed respiratory disorder, obviously stop physical activity and make sure that they seek medical attention. The other side of this is hyperventilation. This is excessive ventilation. This is when people start breathing rapidly and taking quick breaths in quick succession. This can be anticipation or anxiety related to exercise, so somebody starts to hyperventilate. But when you hyperventilate, this is going to increase the pressure of CO2 gradients between the blood and the alveoli. This will decrease the blood's pCO2 level, increase the blood pH, and decrease the drive to breathe. This is typically why individuals who start hyperventilating, either due to excessive crying, anxiety, anticipation, whatnot, tend to pass out. This is because eventually your blood centers say, oh, we have plenty of oxygen, and then you just kind of stop breathing and you pass out. Another important breathing irregularity is the Valsalva maneuver. We discussed this a little bit earlier in this discussion related to cardiovascular. But this can be a potentially dangerous situation, but typically accompanies certain types of exercise. This is when you are breathing against a closed glottis. This can be very beneficial for strength training because it allows us to increase the intra-abdominal pressure by bearing down and increase the intrathoracic pressure by contracting our breathing muscles. This creates a very strong core and allows an individual to remain stable during certain lifts. However, this is not great because this forces our veins to collapse from this high intra-abdominal intrathoracic pressure, which means we have decreased the venous return, decreased our cardiac output, and decreased our arterial blood pressure. So typically we have this Valsalva maneuver that causes this big increase in blood pressure and internal pressure, and then we let it loose and it tanks our blood pressure, and this is why people can pass out. So Valsalva maneuver can be very helpful, but has to be used very responsibly because of its ability to make people pass out and injure themselves. So how does ventilation relate to energy metabolism? So we know our ventilation rate tends to match our metabolic rate, and we have a ventilatory equivalent for oxygen. So we can measure this by the liter of air breathed divided by the liters of oxygen consumed per minute. This index will tell us how well we control our breathing and how that is matched to the body's demand for oxygen. This also brings into effect something called the ventilatory threshold. This is the point where the liters of air breathed is going to be greater than the liters of oxygen consumed. This tends to also hang out near our lactate threshold, and we start to see the increase in the pressure of CO2. So as we can see here, this is an example of ventilation compared to running speed. You notice there's a nice normal tracking and then a sudden spike upwards. Where the spike occurs is our ventilatory threshold, very similar to our lactate threshold. So since we know there's a relationship between ventilatory threshold and lactate threshold, we can use our respiratory responses to estimate lactate threshold. So there is some discussion in the literature of using ventilatory threshold as our surrogate measure. This is because when our ventilatory threshold starts to occur, we're having an excess of lactic acid and sodium bicarbonate buildup. This means we're going to have excess sodium lactate, water, and CO2. This lactic acid CO2 will be accumulated pretty simultaneously. So it is kind of assumed that we need to refine this back to use this as a better estimate of lactate threshold. It also could be used as a measure of anaerobic threshold if we measure both the VE as well of O2 as well as the VE of VCO2. So as you can see here, we have an estimated lactate threshold and then the measurements of VeO2 and VeCO2. So how does our respiratory system limit our performance? So typically, ventilation is not our limiting factor. That's because our respiratory muscles only account for about 10% of our VO2 and 15% of our cardiac output during heavy exercise. Our respiratory muscles are also incredibly fatigue resistant. So unless you are a super high-level elite endurance athlete, this ventilation issue is not going to impact your performance. Also, our airway resistance and our gas diffusion tend to not be a limiting factor at sea level. Now, when we start getting into elevation and altitude, this is going to come into play, but at sea level, this doesn't really matter. And then we also have the restrictive and obstructive pulmonary disorders and respiratory disorders that obviously are going to have some limiting effects. So if somebody's dealing with exercise-induced asthma while working on performance, this is probably going to decline their performance. So the main exception to all of this, as I kind of stated earlier, is our elite endurance trained athletes exercising at high intensity. Ventilation perfusion, and exercise-induced arterial hypoxemia could all kind of lead to some declines in performance. The next important response is the acid-base balance caused by the respiratory system. So we know our metabolic processes are going to produce hydrogen ions. When you get a bunch of hydrogen ions hanging out together, this is going to decrease the pH. That means that we need to start using our blood buffer system. So that hydrogen ion plus our buffer is going to make this hydrogen buffer complex. So we know at rest, our body is slightly alkaline. So we're going to have 7.1 to 7.4 as a blood pH. So any higher pH, we're going to alkalosis, so high blood pH. However, during exercise, our body is going to start going slightly acidic, so 6.6 to 6.9. This is called exercise-induced acidosis. So as you can see here, we have a few changes in our arterial blood pH related to our muscle pH. So physiologically, we need to control our blood pH. We have our chemical buffers with bicarbonate, phosphates, proteins, and hemoglobin in the blood. But we also know if we increase our ventilation, this is going to help our hydrogen ions bind to those bicarbonate ions. This is also going to allow our kidneys to remove the hydrogen ions from the buffers and therefore excrete our hydrogen ions. Our active recovery is also going to facilitate the pH recovery. So if we do passive recovery, so I've worked out really hard and then I just pass out on the couch. It's going to take somewhere between 60 and 120 minutes to recover from that bout of exercise. However, if I exercise really hard and then I do a cool down of some sort, that means I can take my recovery period from 60 to 120 minutes down to 30 to 60 minutes. So having an active recovery is really important. So take a moment here to pause the slide because this is a nice comparison of the different blood components and how they buffer blood pH effectively. This is also another good slide to pause. This looks at the blood and muscle pHs and lactate concentrations 5 minutes after a 400-meter run. So take a moment to examine this. So this graph is going to show the effects of active and passive recovery on blood lactate concentrations after a series of exhaustive sprint bouts. So this kind of relates back to what we just talked about 2 slides before. So the blood lactate removal rate is much faster in the individual in red with the active recovery. So they performed exercise between each bout as compared to the individual who did passive recovery who simply rested between their individual bouts. So this means when you are participating in physical activity and you are taking your recovery time, don't just lay down, sit down, keep yourself moving. So with that said, that is the end of Unit 2 and Chapter 8, and I look forward to hearing back from you guys for Chapter 3, or Unit 3.